There's a huge misconception about what the pharmaceutical industry does and who they are beholden to. Mm-hmm. Because the pharmaceutical industry is not in the business of health and healing. That's not why they are manufacturing drugs. They're in the business of symptoms, maintenance, and disease management. That's what makes them money. That's what's profitable. Mm-hmm. Curing disease is not profitable. So there are a number of cures for various diseases that have been discovered, and then they're bought out by the pharmaceutical industry, or the companies are sued to keep these remedies off of the market because they interfere with drug profits. What people need to really be aware of is that this is not an altruistic business. We're not talking about, CEOs that go to their companies every day that are philanthropists that are trying to heal the world. That's a very unrealistic picture of people to have of what a pharmaceutical industry is about or what they do. Mm-hmm. This industry is beholden to stockholders. They have a legal obligation to consider the stockholders above and beyond the consumer. So if you are aware of that, that makes it a lot more comprehensible as to why they would put drugs on the market that could harm people but were financially beneficial to their stockholders. And that's the point I want to drive home to people. If you're depending on drugs to heal you, you are placing your eggs in the wrong basket.
My niece, who was 20 years old, was attending Indiana University, and she was a pre-med student there. She was in a car accident and was prescribed hydrocodone, Vicodin, which is an opiate painkiller. And she was taking the drugs, and they were causing her such severe sedative properties that she wasn't able to study. So she was trying to pull an all-nighter with some friends to study for an exam the next day, and she went to a local health food store and purchased some ephedra, which is a stimulant. Mm-hmm. She took that concomitantly with her drug and had an adverse reaction. And she ended up in a local hospital, and they labeled her as bipolar and started giving her the whole gamut of antidepressants and mood stabilizers and antipsychotics and all of that. And then she became a mental patient. And I'd like to back up and just say that part of the problem of being labeled in the first place is that those labels go into a medical history, a familial medical history, so that when additional family members who may have the same predisposition to having adverse events, just like I did, because if we're genetically related, we can have some of the same genes, mm-hmm. then those individuals will automatically be labeled when they come up symptomatic because of their relatives. So she had mentioned that she had an aunt who was bipolar, etc.
And they said,
oh, exactly. So no one even entertained the idea that she was having an adverse drug reaction. And of course, because she was toxic, that was the reason she was having the event. And when they added additional drugs, she became more toxic and she became more seriously ill. And at one point, she then got a schizophrenia diagnosis instead of a bipolar diagnosis. And she was on a cocktail of almost 14 different drugs by the time that it was all said and done. Wow. So she had to drop out of school. She was unable to work or to really have any kind or any semblance of a normal life. And eventually she came here to Texas to live with me. And she was trying to get off of her drugs. She was detoxifying. She was doing everything that she could naturally. And because she could not overcome her paranoia and she could not heal quickly enough, my sister was advised to have her put back on drugs. And so my sister called her one day and told her that she had to do something about this. She had to take care of it, and that she had made an appointment for her and that she was taking her back to the psychiatrist and she was going to go back on drugs. Because I'd like to back up and just say that if you don't slowly titrate or slowly wean yourself off of a psychiatric drug, you can throw your body into a complete tailspin. And this is what had happened to my niece. When she determined that it was the drugs that were harming her, she stopped taking them cold turkey. Oh my. And she went into an absolute psychotic tailspin. And so that made it much more difficult for her to detoxify and to self-regulate down the road. So she was struggling and continuing to struggle with depression and paranoia. She couldn't even go to Walmart or anything and feel comfortable. And so my niece was told that, my sister was coming to get her, take her back to the psychiatrist, have her put back on drugs. And she decided that she wasn't going to do that. So she first tried to hang herself. She fashioned a rope from her shoelaces and she tied it to a ceiling fan, and she tried to hang herself, but she was unsuccessful because the weight of her body pulled the fan out of the ceiling. So in desperation, she walked into her younger sister's room and she took an oil lantern, poured the oil over herself and ignited it, and she burned herself alive. It was at that point, it was at that moment that I knew that I had nowhere to go but out with the information, that my life's journey, my experience, my knowledge, my profession, my education, all of it had lined up to make me a credible witness and to make me a credible way shower, to explain to people what had happened to my niece, what had happened to me, and what was happening to them. Because the biggest thing that really bowled me over, the thing that I didn't anticipate when I wrote my book and I started speaking out about this subject, was how many victims there were. The vast number of people who had had this experience that I had was it was mind-boggling. And the number of people that were desperate for help, that were turning to professionals, that were turning them away and telling them that there was nothing they could do, that they didn't know how to detoxify people, that they didn't know how to help people get off of the drugs. They were given a life sentence the minute they received that label and that diagnosis, and they were never allowed to try anything else. There were no alternatives that were recommended. There were no other options for these people but to continue to take these toxic chemicals and to become less and less of an individual. They lose their sovereignty spiritually. They lose their rights as citizens. They lose their cognitive abilities. They lose the frontal lobe capacity to think, to create, to be what makes us human. And those were the things that I knew I had a moral responsibility now to speak out about. So that was my turning point. When I lost one of the most beautiful people that I had ever known in my life, I made it my life's goal to explain to others why it had happened.
And it sounds like the turning point for her was hearing that she was going to be taken back into the mental hospital.
It absolutely was the turning point, because we had gone to court and everything to try to get her to be able to legally be off drugs. And the court had granted her permission to not be on drugs because she'd been mandated. I mean, once you're told legally by the court, you have to be on drugs, then you have to stay on drugs until the court allows you to get off. And she had gone through that process and had been allowed to get off the drugs, but then she wasn't able to heal quickly enough. And of course, my sister did what everyone does. She deferred to an authority figure. She didn't know what to do, and she asked someone else, and she took that advice and ran with it, and it cost her her daughter's life.
What I would really like to say is that people have to be proactive and do their own due diligence. In the age of information, ignorance is a choice. So I insist that people do their own due diligence. You are giving your power away to an authority figure if you take everything they tell you for face value and run with it. You are making yourself available to be victimized by profiteering corporations because they have an ulterior motive, and that is profit. And you need to be aware of that. So if someone is prescribing you a drug, then as a patient and as a consumer, it is your responsibility to get online and do a little homework. And you don't just put the name of the drug into Google or another search engine. You put the name of the drug, and then behind that you put in side effects and controversy. And you will open the can of worms that needs to be opened, because where there is smoke, trust me, there is fire in the pharmaceutical industry, because they are very proactive about shutting people up and putting the lid on things that are not true. They are very prolific in suing people. So if you find lots of information out on the web where people are screaming to their top of their lungs, which many patients do get on the web these days and tell their stories, then do some more investigating and find out why are people screaming to the top of their lungs about this. And do not take the manufacturer's site for gospel, because the thing they need to worry about more than their doctors being bribed is their doctors being misinformed, because there is an ongoing dis and misinformation campaign taking place about pharmaceuticals. And if you're not aware of that and you make yourself available to these people, you will become victimized by that. So what I'm telling people, and what I insist on anyone who contacts me and asks me for my information, is to do your own homework. Don't allow people to talk over your head. Don't allow people to intimidate you. And when I say people, I mean physicians and other healthcare providers, because that is their MO. Their modus operandi is, I'll talk over your head and therefore I'll intimidate you because you won't know what I'm talking about, and you'll do what I say because I'm the authority figure. Well, what I say is, stop playing small. Own up to your own personal responsibility about your health. Do your own research, learn their language, and ask questions. If they aren't open to you to answer your questions and to let you partner in your own health care, find another doctor. You wouldn't go buy a new car by just going to one lot and shopping. Don't do it with your health care, where our lives are on the line, and you have to be responsible.
Thank you so much for your time today, Gwen.